Hi everybody, it's me again, and the book I'm going to read this evening is by Shirley Hughes, and the name of this book is Dogger, and Dogger is the name of this little boy's favourite toy. I spoke yesterday about some of the books that I've chosen that were written quite a long time ago. This book was written, and it says it here, in 1977, so for those of you that are good at maths, see if you can work out how long ago that is. But that's when this book was written. But I still love this book, and I think it's a really great story. So it's by Shirley Hughes. Once there was a soft brown toy called Dogger. One of his ears pointed upwards and the other flopped over. His fur was worn in places because he was quite old, and he belonged to Dave. Dave was very fond of Dogger, and he took him everywhere. Sometimes he gave him rides in a trolley. Sometimes he pulled him along on a lead made of string like a real dog, and when it was cold he wrapped him up in a bit of blanket. Now and again Dave's mum said that Dogger was getting much too dirty, and she showed Dave how to wash him in a bowl of soapy water, and then they hung him up by his tail on the washing line to dry. Dave's baby brother Joe liked hard toys. He liked putting them in his mouth and biting on them because he was getting teeth. And Dave's big sister Bella took 7 teddies to bed with her every night. She had to sleep right up against the wall to stop herself from falling out. But Dave liked only Dogger. One afternoon, Dave and Mum set out to collect Bella from school. Mum took Joe in the pushchair and Dave took Dogger. Next to the school gate where the mums waited was a playing field, and some people with ladders were putting up coloured flags. Mum said there was going to be a summer fair to get money to buy things for the school. Dave pushed Dogger up against the railings to show him what was going on. Just then the children started to come out of school, and an ice cream van came round the corner playing a tune. Bella ran up with a satchel flying. "Mum, can we have an ice cream?" Mum gave her the money for 2 cones. Joe didn't have a whole ice cream to himself because he was too dribbly. On the way home, Dave walked beside the pushchair, giving Joe licks off his ice cream. Joe kicked his feet about and shouted for more in between licks. At tea time, Dave was rather quiet, and in the bath he was even quieter. And at bedtime, he said, "I want Dogger." But Dogger was nowhere to be found. Mum looked under the bed. She looked behind the cupboard. She searched in the kitchen and underneath the stairs. Dave watched anxiously through the banisters, and Joe watched anxiously through the bars of his cot. Bella even joined in to look for Dogger. She turned out her own toy box just in case he was in there, but he wasn't. And when Dad came home, he looked for Dogger too. He searched in the shed and down the garden path with a torch, but Dogger was quite lost. Dave was very sad when he went to bed. Bella very kindly lent him one of her teddies to go to sleep with, but it wasn't the same thing as Dogger. And Dave kept waking up in the night and missing him. The next day was Saturday, and they all went to the school summer fair, and the playing field was full of stalls and sideshows. And there was a fancy dress parade, and here were all the children dressed up in their costumes. See if you can spot which characters they are. Then there were sports with an egg and spoon race, a wheelbarrow race, and a dad's race. There are all the dads running. Bella was very good at races, and she won the 3-legged race with her friend Barbara. "Wouldn't you like to go in for a race?" they asked Dave. But Dave didn't feel like racing. He was missing Dogger so much. Then another very exciting thing happened to Bella. She won first prize in a raffle. It was a huge yellow teddy bear wearing a beautiful blue silk bow, and he was almost as big as Dave. Dave didn't like that teddy at all, and at that moment he didn't like Bella very much either because she kept on winning things, and he went off on his own to look at the stalls. One lady had a toy stall full of knitted ducks and cars and baby dolls in bonnets. And there, right at the very back of the stall, behind a load of other toys, was Dogger. And he was wearing a ticket saying 5p. There were a lot of people round the stall. Dave tried to explain to the lady it was his dogger who'd got lost and somehow been put on the stall by mistake, but she wasn't listening. He looked in his pocket. He had 3p, but it wasn't enough. He ran to find Mum and Dad to ask them to buy Dogger back at once. Dave went everywhere in the crowd, but he couldn't see Mum and Dad. He thought he was going to cry. At last he found Bella by the cakes, and when she heard about Dogger, she and Dave raced back to the toy stall as fast as they could. But something terrible had happened. Dogger had been bought by a little girl, and she was already walking off with him, and Dave began to cry. Bella ran after her, and she tried to explain that Dogger really belonged to Dave, and could they please buy him back, but the little girl said no. She said that she'd bought Dogger with her own money and she wanted him, and she held on to him very tightly. Dave cried and cried. And then the little girl started to cry too. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Bella's big yellow teddy. And she stopped crying and she put out her hand to stroke its beautiful blue silk bow. Then Bella did something very kind. "Would you swap this teddy for my brother's dog then?" she asked. And right away, the little girl stopped crying and she started to smile. She held out Dogger to Dave, took the big teddy instead, and went off with him in her arms. Then Dave smiled too. He hugged Dogger and he hugged Bella round the waist. "Thank you, Bella," he said. "Thank you." That night, Dave had Dogger in bed beside him and Bella was practising somersaults. "Shall you miss that big teddy?" Dave asked her. "No," said Bella. "I didn't like him that much, really. He was too big and his eyes were too staring. Anyway, if I had another teddy in my bed, there wouldn't be room for me." And there they are, warm and safe. And Dave with his Dogger and Bella with her teddy. So that's the end of my story. Good night.